Welcome to a special edition of the CX Files. Over the course of the past several days, the situation in South Africa's provinces of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng have degenerated badly in terms of violence, looting, and rioting. This has severe potential consequences for the customer experience management sector, which over the past 2 decades has made South Africa a beachhead for CX delivery into English-speaking demand markets. To get a sense of what's happening on the ground and what outsourcers servicing clients from South Africa should be on the lookout for, the CX Files spoke to Mark Essey, who is the CEO at Capability BPO based in Durban, along with 2 experienced BPO consultants in the form of Stephen Loynd, who is the chief analyst at TrendzOwl, and Dave Rumble, who is the co-founder of the Knowledge Group. Let's go straight to this interview. This is a special edition of the CX Files. As everybody knows, the situation in South Africa over the course of the past 4 or 5 days has been very severe. And given the extent to which the customer experience industry globally has made South Africa one of the central hubs, we felt it would be good to talk to some thought leaders as well as a provider that's based in South Africa about the situation on the ground and potential scenarios from a customer experience management standpoint that need to be considered. Now, we're very fortunate today to be joined by 3 stars in their own right. From Durban, South Africa, we have Mark Essey, who is the CEO of Capability BPO. From Virginia, we have Stephen Loynd, who is the chief analyst at TrendzOwl. And from the UK, we're joined by Dave Rumble, who is a longtime advocate of South African BPO and who's worked extensively in that country. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us at short notice and under some very difficult circumstances.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be here.
Good to have you here. Good to have you here. And Mark, I would like to start the discussion with yourself today. Now, I think a lot of people aren't certain about what's going on in South Africa. A lot of people have been seeing videos that have been circulating around the internet over the course of the past 2 or 3 days. Could you give us a state of play as it stands right now where you are in Durban in terms of where the situation sits?
Sure, Peter. So where we are today is that things have pretty much been brought under control. The police and some of the military have moved in and have they're at quite an advanced stage of sort of restoring proper law and order. Cleanups have started happening in most of the greater Durban area. Fuel deliveries are starting. In fact, I was able to fill a full tank of fuel earlier, which I'm very happy for. So I know there have been a lot of images all over the internet about queues outside petrol stations and food outlets, and those are true. But with fuel starting to move in, the whole supply chain will start going. And thankfully, I think the queues and the shortages will be a thing of the past in a couple of days. The taxis are starting to operate, and as I'm sure you're all aware, our public transport is largely taxi-based, or what you'd call a minivan, I suppose. Yeah. And those are going to start running tomorrow. Obviously, fuel shortages are still an issue, so they won't return to full service. I just got a communication from the Durban Metro that public transport will be running tomorrow. In some areas, it won't be a full service, so there will be a limited service, but it's going to start running tomorrow. So hopefully we're starting to see a sense of normality return to Durban.
Okay, well, that's really good news, Mark, and thank you for that update. From the standpoint of the industry, if we're to look at what's going on from a business perspective, this morning I was forwarded an email from Business Unity South Africa, which is one of the main overarching commercial bodies representing businesses in the country. They called for the implementation of a 24-hour curfew and the full deployment of army and police, including reserve forces. Obviously, an organization like that wouldn't make a declaration like this without having thought it through and without having just cause. Mark, can you talk a little bit about how the industry, the CX industry, has been responding and what has been happening from the perspective of ensuring business continuity?
So, as you know, we have a very active industry body in BPESA, and they have been engaging with the highest levels of government to ensure that the industry is protected. There are currently discussions happening around special dispensations to get agents in and out of work. And I would imagine, I cannot say this with absolute certainty, but that discussions, just as during COVID, to give us special status to be able to travel through curfew will be granted. So while there may be a 24-hour curfew, there'll be a series of permits that will be issued. And I'm speculating here just based on what happened in the past with the response to COVID, where we will be allowed to transport staff in and out of work, or staff will be able to travel with their own transport in and out of work throughout the 24-hour period.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Now, Dave, I want to shift the discussion over to you for a few minutes. Obviously, you've been a longtime advocate for South Africa as a BPO and CX delivery point, and with very good reason. It's worth mentioning that South Africa was ranked the most favored offshore location amongst enterprise CX buyers in 2021, according to the Ryan Strategic Advisory Front Office Omnibus Survey. But obviously, the dynamic has changed very much over the course of the past few days. From your perspective, what should BPO investors be looking for over the course of the next coming days and weeks in regards to their own deployments in South Africa? What are some of the key hints or some of the key messages you're going to be looking for?
Well, Mark has already highlighted the approach and the response that the industry had around the early stages of pandemic and the immediate response. And the level of the level of commitment, not just from the providers, but also from the supporting agencies in terms of the government. Mark's mentioned BPESA as the industry body, but more importantly, the access into government to allow the support for the providers to be able to continue to deliver service despite the military involvement in the lockdown and the preservation of life in terms of the COVID pandemic. So, I think there's a track record from a South African perspective that, the industry is very important to the country, and we shouldn't underestimate that. I mean, some of the issues that are manifesting themselves today are because of issues around employment or unemployment. And the industry is well placed, and as a consequence of that, well placed to provide employment for people. And so, so I would urge the providers to engage broadly with local industry, and more importantly with the government and the agencies that are supportive, and look at that as a much more proactive point. South Africa isn't alone in these issues. I mean, we've had them in Washington in the last 12 months. So, it's not something that's isolated. There is an underlying current with folks being disaffected, which then gets propelled into these, kind of dynamic issues. We saw it with Arab Spring across North Africa, a good number of years ago. So I think it comes down to these things. It's about patience. So we have to understand that there are some deep-rooted issues. The reforms that Ramaphosa's bringing in probably aren't arriving as quickly. You've got the issues of the kind of the post-Zuma regime kind of coming through in terms of this, in terms of the disaffection. So from a supply side perspective, I'd urge engagement and collaboration, which, South Africa, has got a good track record for doing. And then I think for the patience and just the willingness to engage more broadly into the wider conversations about how we engage this disaffected community in terms of bringing them into employment, because ultimately that'll be the issues. The economic position will be the issue where people can get gainful employment, and BPO is going to be play a part in that in terms of the growth of the country. So I think patience would be the thing. I think there are going to be some short-term issues with service, but hey, look, in the last 6-12 months, it doesn't matter if you're internationally servicing, you're going to have got some issues at some point in your infrastructure. So, the good news, and great to hear Mark, saying that the, particularly KZN, which seems to be much more badly affected. I mean, there haven't been any incidents in the Western Cape, but KZN getting on top of it, Gauteng as well, I think is, it's a good sign. So it's a disruption for 4 or 5 days. But what it is signal is, look, this is a long-term underlying issue. These things wouldn't have happened without there being a long-term underlying issue.
So Dave, on that point about the BPOs themselves, obviously there's many that are servicing their clients in different parts of the world. What would you recommend that the outsourcing community do in order to communicate? What should they be communicating to their clients, whether they be in the United Kingdom, in Australia, or North America?
Well, I think there's, with any decision around where you locate services, there's always an element of risk with any kind of location choices which aren't on the domestic home front. I mean, we've got, as I said, we've got issues domestically that probably not dissimilar as a consequence of the way society is moving. But I think there is a growing need, and pandemic has thrown the notion up of flex shoring, which I think is something that a lot of organisations are looking at as a proactive risk management approach to say, well, look, I need to not have all my capacity in one location, and I need to have a capability to move work and for business continuity reasons and customer experience reasons. And South Africa, the industry isn't really that big in comparison to some of the other geographic locations. So I think, as the ambitions, the broader long-term ambitions that the South Africa has publicly quoted in terms of growing the industry to the size and scale to complement more progressive Western economies in the kind of 500,000 territory over the next 5 or 10 years, those ambitions will not get fulfilled if we don't address the fundamental underlying issues. And I think that's the big thing. So come back to your original question. I think any risk and any risks associated should be built into the sourcing environment, and that a client should take a risk-based view about how they locate services and not be overly dependent on a single location where these types of things could happen. So, we don't know what country it might happen in next, but it's happening in South Africa today. So, I just urge buyers have their eyes on the management of those sorts of risks.
Steve, from the perspective of the United States where you're based, it's interesting to note that South Africa was rated in the 2021 Front Office Omnibus Survey as by far the most favored offshore location. There's been tremendous headway that's been made by all the different stakeholders, whether it's BPASA, whether it is providers like Mark's Capability, BPO, in terms of cultivating the US market. And I think gaining a fair amount of traction in regards to not just goodwill, but actual jobs that have been deployed in South Africa to service American consumers. In your view, given the events of the past few days, what should these industry players, whether it's the industry association or whether it's the outsourcers themselves, what should they be doing to communicate? What should be the message to the American market to make sure that all the ground that has been gained the past few years isn't lost over the course of what we've seen since Sunday and Monday?
Thank you, Peter, for having me. Great question. And I'm going to continue one of the main points that Dave made, which I think is an excellent one. If we span back and look at this thing, it's this crisis is a global one. We've got, for example, a serious situation in Colombia as far as protests go as well. That's just one example. Colombia being very popular for good reason for the contact center industry. But it's not just Colombia. I mean, here in the United States, I'm just outside of DC across the river, the Potomac. And in January, we had a bit of a surreal scene ourselves here in the Capitol. And so that is in no way meant to downplay what's happening in South Africa. It's a serious situation. But at the same time, the first point that I'd like to make to any listeners here in the United States and in North America is that it is a global crisis, and we should keep that perspective. The second point I would make is that the potential in South Africa is still there. I retweeted a blog that I wrote at the end of 2017 during one of my visits down to South Africa with you, Peter, and others, and describing the impressive nature of the talent there and all the initiatives that are going into things like digital skills. And we visited a number and met a number of organizations there. And so the potential is very much there still. And then another point that I think Dave and Mark also made, and this is extremely important, is that one thing I've learned in my many trips down to South Africa is that the relationship between the public and the private sectors, the collaboration there is very strong. And the growth initiatives include the business process outsourcing space. Since 2010, the contributions of the global business services sector, I've learned, have grown exponentially. And so this is definitely going to put a little bit of a wrinkle in that. But as Dave was reiterating, I think that momentum will pick up again once South Africa gets through this crisis, and let's hope that that's the case. There is one stat for those here in North America to keep in mind, and that is that North America is the fastest growing source market for global service delivery. It's something out of South Africa, something like 18%. And we can double check that if we need to, that stat. But over the past year, I was told that by a couple of people. And so the final point I think I'd make on that is that AWS itself, you'll recall, made an investment in a new data center in South Africa. They're rolling out in the cloud there over the course of the past year. And so they're looking to rapidly enable communities to engage through cloud technologies and using South Africa as a bit of a platform to do that. And so let's keep all those things in mind as the news continues to unfold. There is the point, I suppose, that I'd make, while at the same time, it is a serious situation and we're all hoping for the best.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I think that, you've made a number of very good points in regards to the investment, the ongoing investment from the United States into South Africa. And Dave, I think that it's worth mentioning too that South Africa is a very big country, and while we have seen some of these issues that have popped up in Durban and in the Gauteng area, there are other parts of the country that have been relatively untouched and where service delivery is still going on in a fairly seamless fashion.
Yeah. Well, it's it is a big place. From the point of view of the perceptions of outsiders, it does tend to boil down to only three places, which is Cape Town, Joburg, and Durban. So but it is a huge country. It's it's not a short flight. So I think the manifestation and the challenges, the underlying challenges that obviously have permeated as a consequence of this. They are a combination of localized issues, and the management and the expectation and management of the populace in those areas, particularly around employment. And I think that's where the growth, and it will be predominantly fueled by the US as the source market into South Africa. There is absolutely no doubt that the US buyer is probably singularly the most important buyer to the providers and the ecosystems in South Africa in terms of generating that employment. So, I wouldn't underplay the severity of the situation as it is now, but with an eye to the longer term, and hopefully with the ambitions that the Ramaphosa government have got, that they will be able to address some of these underlying structural issues and move forward. But if you want to outsource to Cape Town, there are no issues in Cape Town today. And they haven't had any, kind of manifest issues. But if you're load balancing in South Africa, and come back to that risk around locations, you're probably not going to put all your work in Cape Town, or the Western Cape. You're going to need to spread it around. So inevitably, you're going to get some exposure. So, so I do think it's about being more progressive and patient about the reforms that that the current government are going through.
Mark, I'm going to give you the final word today. What's your message as a leading independent BPO provider in South Africa to the rest of the world?
So I think the message I'd like to leave is that there have been some very, very hard lessons learned over the last 5 days for the country, for the industry. All of you have dealt with South Africans. We quick learners. We adapt very quickly, take on board what we need to, and get on with the business of doing business. I agree with what David and Stephen have said. There are some fundamental underlying issues that need to be addressed and need to be addressed with more urgency than they have in the past. But South Africa still remains an extremely viable outsourcing destination. There's a huge talent pool. And as with many things, when you look at television, it looks like the whole country is involved in the rioting and the looting, but it's small pockets. But those pockets do look, it's just how things unfold. It's not the entire population. It's not the entire community in Durban or wherever things are happening. These are individuals that are probably organized and have a very real agenda that they've been playing to. But I know rugby's not played in the US, but never write off the South African rugby team. And I'm saying exactly the same about the BPO industry. I think we're going to be back stronger, and the lessons learned will definitely be taken forward and implemented into how we do business every day and what we deliver.
Thanks, Mark. I don't think anybody could have said it better. We really appreciate that. And I think I speak for all of us when we say good luck to you, good luck to the industry, and good luck to all the good citizens of South Africa.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to David and Stephen, and thanks for the support. We really appreciate it.
Gentlemen, it's been great catching up, and we look forward to seeing you all live very soon. So take care, and thanks for joining the CX Files this week.
Cheers. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.